What would you do if the world had written you off? If, with your last $2, you bought the one thing even more forgotten than you were, a collapsed cabin no one had seen in 20 years? That's the choice a young woman named Harriet Lowe faced in the hard country of 1880s Idaho, when she traded everything she had for a pile of rotten logs and a deed to nowhere. But the truth waiting for her under a loose hearthstone wasn't just a map, but a challenge left behind by a ghost, a trail of secrets that would lead her deeper into the mountains and toward a discovery that would rewrite the very lines on the map of her world. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the trapper's last survey. Harriet Lowe arrived in the raw little town of Ketchum with the dust of the road ground into the hem of her only good dress and the silence of dismissal ringing in her ears. She was 21, but the last 6 months serving in the house of a Boise timber baron had aged her spirit. She'd been let go over a broken porcelain pitcher, a thing she hadn't even touched. But the lady of the house needed someone to blame, and a quiet orphan girl with no one to speak for her was the easiest target. The injustice of it was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She'd been given her final wages, a paltry $10, and told to be gone by morning. Now, standing on a plank sidewalk with her worn carpetbag in hand, she felt as insignificant as a single speck of dust in the vast, indifferent sweep of the Sawtooth Range that loomed over the town. Men on horseback clattered past, their faces leathered by sun and wind, not one of them giving her a second glance. She was invisible, a ghost long before her time. Her meager funds wouldn't last a week at the boarding house. She needed a place, any place that was hers. That's what led her to the Territorial Land Office, a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale tobacco and dry paper. A clerk with a green eye shade, Mr. Ames, looked up from his ledger, his expression weary. Before she could speak, a loud voice boomed from a corner. "Well, look what the stage coughed up." A man named Silas Croft, whom she'd already heard about in town, a speculator who bought and sold claims with a predator's glee, leaned back in his chair, thumbs hooked in his waistcoat. He appraised her with a dismissive smirk. "Lost, little lady?" Harriet ignored him, her gaze fixed on the clerk. "I'm looking to buy a piece of land," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "Something small, something cheap." Croft laughed outright, a harsh, barking sound. "Cheap? Honey, the only thing cheap around here is talk." Mr. Ames, to his credit, gave Croft a sidelong glare before turning back to Harriet. "Not much available for a small purse, miss. Most everything's been claimed for mining or timber." He paused, tapping a long finger on a large, rolled map. "There is one thing. A trapper's plot. Up in the East Fork Basin. Has a cabin on it, or so the deed says. No one's laid eyes on it in a decade. Man who owned it, Alastair Finch, just vanished. Went into the mountains one fall and never came out. The territories repossessed it for back taxes." "How much?" Harriet asked, her heart starting a slow, heavy beat. $2, the clerk said. Croft choked on another laugh. $2 for a pile of rot and grizzly bears for neighbors. That cabin's likely nothing but a stain on the ground by now. But Harriet heard something else in the description. She heard solitude. She heard a place so forgotten that no one would bother her, a place where she could finally be left alone. "I'll take it," she said, her voice finding a sudden firmness. She opened her purse and laid $2 silver on the counter. They shone dully in the lamplight. The sound they made was the heaviest, most final sound she had ever heard. The transaction was simple, The paperwork, a single sheet of brittle paper with her name written in the clerk's careful hand. Harriet Lowe, landowner. The words felt foreign, impossible. Silas Croft watched the whole affair with undisguised contempt. "You'll be back before the first snow, begging for work," he sneered as she folded the deed and placed it carefully in her bag. "That mountain eats people like you for breakfast." She met his gaze for a single, silent moment, her expression unreadable, and then turned and walked out without a word. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. With her remaining $8, she went not to the mercantile for supplies, but to the livery. There, in a back pen, stood a mule the color of a dusty mouse. He was old, one ear flopped over, and he regarded her with an expression of profound, weary skepticism. The liveryman wanted $5 for him. "He's stubborn, but he's sure-footed," the man said. "Name's Jedediah." Harriet paid the man, leaving her with just $3 for flour, salt, coffee, an axe, and a length of rope. She loaded her new companion with her few possessions. The mule, Jed, accepted the burden with a long, mournful sigh, as if to say he'd seen this kind of foolishness before and expected no good to come of it. As she led him through the main street, the town watched. Faces appeared in windows. Men paused on the saloon porch. Their whispers followed her like a cloud of flies, a chorus of pity and scorn. She was the fool girl who'd bought the ghost's cabin. What did she think she was going to do up there? How long before she starved or froze? Did she even know how to fire a gun? Harriet kept her eyes fixed on the jagged line of the peaks ahead, her jaw set. Their mockery was just another kind of weather, something to be endured. She had her deed, her mule, and a direction. It was more than she'd had yesterday. What secret was hiding in that forgotten cabin? Could one person's trash truly be another's treasure? Or was Harriet walking into a trap set by the unforgiving wilderness? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. Now, as the last buildings of Ketchum fell away behind her, the real journey was about to begin. As she made her final preparations at the edge of town, a shadow fell over her. Harriet looked up from tightening a cinch on Jed's pack. An old Shoshone woman stood there, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and deep as a forest pool. She held a small, tightly woven basket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The town's noise seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of the wind in the pines and the soft jingle of the mule's harness. The woman's gaze wasn't pitying or scornful. It was something else, something ancient and knowing. She looked from Harriet to the mountains and back again. Then she reached out a dry, warm hand and laid it gently on Harriet's arm. The touch was startlingly intimate. "The mountains are patient," the old woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They remember those who listen." That was all. She gave a slight nod, turned, and walked away as silently as she had appeared, disappearing around the corner of the blacksmith's shop. The words hung in the air, cryptic and heavy. Harriet didn't understand them, not then, but she felt their weight settle over her, a strange sort of blessing or a warning. She couldn't be sure which. The encounter, however brief, served as a counterpoint to the town's derision. Silas Croft had made one last show of it, striding out of the saloon as she passed, a whiskey glass in his hand. "A toast," he'd shouted to the men on the porch. "To the Queen of Finch's Folly. May her reign be short and her return swift." The men had laughed, a ragged, cruel sound that followed her up the trail. But the old woman's words felt more real, more lasting than their fleeting mockery. Harriet stored the phrase away, turning it over in her mind as she and Jed began the slow, arduous climb into the high country. It was a single, strange seed of hope planted in the barren soil of her departure. The trail was little more than a game track, fading in and out of existence. For 3 days they climbed, leaving the world of men and their judgments far behind. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of pine resin and cold stone. The scale of the landscape was humbling. Great, granite-faced mountains clawed at a sky of impossible blue. Valleys opened up beneath them, vast and green and empty. Harriet felt her own smallness, but for the first time, it wasn't a source of shame. Out here, everyone was small. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk, the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, and the steady, rhythmic plod of Jed's hooves on the rocky ground. The mule was proving his worth. He navigated treacherous scree slopes and narrow ledges with a placid determination that Harriet found herself trying to emulate. He was her silent companion, a steady, living presence in the overwhelming emptiness. His occasional soft snort or the flick of his one good ear was all the conversation she needed. He was, like her, a creature discarded by the world, now finding his purpose in a place no one else wanted. On the 4th day, guided by the crude map on her deed, she found it. The cabin was tucked into a small meadow, beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. But it was worse, so much worse, than she had allowed herself to imagine. Croft's taunts echoed in her mind. It wasn't a cabin so much as the memory of one. The roof, heavy with years of snow, had sagged in the middle like the spine of a dying animal. The single door hung from one leather hinge, gaping open to the darkness within. The log walls were gray and weathered, the chinking long since crumbled away, leaving gaps you could put a fist through. Weeds and wild raspberry canes grew thick around its foundation, trying to pull it back into the earth. Disappointment washed over her, cold and sharp as the creek water. For a dizzying moment, she felt the full, crushing weight of her foolishness. The townspeople were right. Croft was right. She had traded her last dollars for a ruin, a tomb. She tethered Jed in the meadow where the grass was good and walked slowly toward the structure. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, of damp earth and mouse nests and time itself. A pack rat had built a massive nest in one corner. The floor was littered with debris, and the stone fireplace was black and silent. It was a place of profound and utter abandonment. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep inside. She built a small, clean fire a dozen yards away, using deadfall from the surrounding pines. She made coffee and ate a piece of dry bread, watching the stars emerge, impossibly bright and close in the thin mountain air. Jed grazed nearby, his steady presence a small comfort. The cabin groaned and settled in the night wind, a sound like a man sighing in his sleep. Harriet sat wrapped in her blanket, listening to its mournful voice, and wondered if she had the strength to make this dead thing live again. The old woman's words came back to her. The mountains are patient. They remember those who listen. What was this place trying to tell her? The next morning, Harriet began to work. There was no grand plan, just a simple, dogged refusal to surrender. She started by evicting the pack rat, a noisy, chaotic battle involving a long stick and a great deal of shouting. Then came the sweeping. She used a pine bough to clear away years of accumulated dirt, leaves, and animal droppings. Underneath the debris, the puncheon floor was mostly solid. the split logs worn smooth by a solitary man's footsteps. Each small act of cleaning felt like an act of defiance against the decay. She dragged out the broken furniture, a three-legged stool and a collapsed cot, and set it in the sun. The labor was grueling. Her hands, softened by domestic work, were soon raw and blistered. Her back ached. But with every bucket of clean water she hauled from the creek, with every armful of debris she cleared, the cabin felt a little less like a tomb and a little more like a shelter. Her silent companion, Jed, would watch her from the meadow, his one good ear cocked in her direction, as if supervising her efforts. In the afternoons, he would amble over and stand patiently while she leaned against his warm flank, catching her breath. His quiet solidity was a balm to her frayed spirit. She spent 2 days patching the roof, using fallen bark, pine boughs, and thick squares of sod she cut from the meadow. It was clumsy work, but it would keep out the worst of the rain. She rehung the door using new leather straps cut from a piece of her own luggage. It swung shut with a satisfying thud, enclosing the space for the first time in years. The interior was still dark and rough, but it was hers. It was a room. It was a defense against the vast wilderness outside. On the 3rd day of her labor, she turned her attention to the fireplace. It was a solid, well-built structure of river stone, the heart of the little cabin. As she swept out the cold, packed ash from the hearth, her hand brushed against one of the flat stones that formed the apron in front of the firebox. It shifted slightly under her weight. She frowned, pushing at it again. It rocked, just a fraction of an inch. The others were set firm in a bed of clay and mortar. This one was different. She knelt, running her fingers around its edge. The mortar line was thinner here, a slightly different color, as if it had been applied later than the rest. It was a detail so small as to be almost invisible, an anomaly, a thing that did not fit. Most people would have ignored it, swept the dirt back over it, and forgotten. But Harriet's life had been one of noticing small details: a misplaced teacup, a speck of dust on a polished table, the subtle shift in a mistress's tone. Her survival had depended on seeing what others missed. She looked at the stone, a faint prickle of curiosity disturbing the rhythm of her exhaustion. It was just a stone, but it was a question in a room that should have held no more secrets. For now, she left it, but the thought of it stayed with her, a loose thread she knew she would eventually have to pull. The work of survival took precedence. Harriet spent the next week chinking the logs of the cabin, mixing clay from the creek bank with dry grass to create a thick, insulating plaster. She worked her way around the small structure, sealing it against the wind and the coming cold. It was messy, repetitive labor, but it was deeply satisfying. With each gap she filled, the cabin felt more whole, more sound. Her hands became tools, caked with mud. Her mind focused on the simple, honest task before her. She was not a servant here, waiting on the whims of others. She was a builder, a creator. The cabin and the valley were her only masters, and they demanded only one thing: effort. During her work, Jed was her constant shadow. He would follow her to the creek, stand patiently as she dug the clay, and doze in the sun as she pressed the mixture into the walls. She talked to him sometimes, not expecting an answer, but simply to hear a human voice break the profound silence. She told him about her life in Boise, about the broken pitcher, about the smug face of Silas Croft. The mule would listen, his long ears twitching, and occasionally nudge her with his soft nose, a gesture of simple, uncomplicated comfort. The rhythm of her days fell into a simple pattern: rise with the sun, Work until her muscles screamed, eat a spare meal by the fire, and fall into an exhausted sleep. The physical toll was immense, but her spirit, so bruised and battered when she'd arrived, began to heal. The clean, cold air and the honest labor were a kind of medicine. But always, at the back of her mind, was the loose hearthstone. Every evening, as she sat by her small fire inside the now-sealed cabin, her eyes would be drawn to it. It was a quiet puzzle, a whisper from the man who had lived here before her. What had he hidden? A few coins? A personal trinket? Or was it nothing at all? Just a poorly laid stone. One night, a week after her arrival, a cold rain began to fall. It drummed steadily on her newly patched roof, a sound that should have been comforting. But a small, persistent drip began to fall near the fireplace. It wasn't coming from the roof, but from the chimney itself. Water was finding its way down the stonework. She realized with a jolt that if water could get in, it would pool in the hollow space she suspected was beneath that stone. Whatever was under there, if anything, could be ruined. The thought spurred her to action. She took the small pry bar from her pack of tools and knelt before the hearth. The fire cast flickering shadows on the wall as she worked the tip of the bar into the thin seam of mortar. It resisted at first. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. Then, with a soft, scraping sound, the mortar gave way. She worked her way around the stone, chipping away the seal. Finally, she slid the bar underneath and heaved. The stone, heavy and slick with soot, lifted up and tilted to the side. Beneath it was a hollow, just as she'd suspected. It was about a foot square and 6 inches deep, lined with a carefully folded piece of oilcloth to keep out the damp. And nestled inside, protected by the cloth, was a tightly rolled cylinder of scraped deerskin, tied with a leather thong. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she reached into the dark space and lifted it out. It was light, almost weightless. She untied the thong and slowly, carefully, unrolled the hide on the floor in the firelight. It was not a letter. It was a map. The map was drawn with charcoal and some kind of berry ink, the lines stark against the pale, creamy surface of the hide. It was a work of patient artistry. It showed the valley she was in, marking her cabin with a small, careful drawing of a smoking chimney. But it also showed the terrain beyond, terrain she had never seen. It depicted landmarks with a woodsman's precision, a waterfall that split in two, a ridge that looked like a sleeping giant, a single lightning-scarred pine on a high pass. And 3 valleys to the east, deeper and higher into the mountain wilderness, was a single, deliberate X. Beside it, in the same careful hand, was a drawing of another cabin, this one seemingly nestled against a sheer cliff face. There were no words, no explanation, just the trail and the destination. For 2 days, Harriet hesitated. The journey looked perilous. The map showed a route that crossed high, exposed ridges, and descended into steep, unknown canyons. Winter was coming. The nights were already sharp with frost. To leave the meager safety of her repaired cabin and venture deeper into the wilderness felt like madness. It could be a wild goose chase, a joke played by a dead man. Silas Croft's mocking voice echoed in her mind. That mountain eats people like you. But the map felt like a promise. Alistair Finch, the trapper, had not been a fool. The careful construction of the first cabin, the clever hiding place, the beautifully rendered map, it all spoke of a deliberate, thoughtful mind. This was not a whim. It was an invitation. She decided to trust the man she had never met. She packed enough supplies for a week, loaded the patient Jed, and with the deerskin map tucked safely inside her coat, she left her small, hard-won home and followed the ghost's trail. The journey was a test of everything she had. The landmarks on the map were real, but finding them required a constant, wearying attention to the landscape. The lightning-scarred pine was her guide across a wind-blasted pass, where the air was so thin it hurt to breathe. The sleeping giant ridge forced her to lead Jed along a narrow ledge with a 1,000-foot drop just inches away. The mule never faltered, placing his hooves with an innate, stubborn wisdom that gave her courage. On the 5th day, exhausted and bone-weary, she found the second cabin. It was exactly where the map had indicated, tucked into an alcove at the base of a massive granite cliff, almost invisible until you were right upon it. This one was in far better condition. The door was solid oak, the windows had oiled paper panes, and the roof was sound. Inside, it was spare but immaculate. A bed with a folded wool blanket, a small stove, a single chair and table. It was as if the owner had simply walked out for the afternoon. And there, laid squarely in the center of the table, was another map. This one was drawn on a large piece of canvas, weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones. It was even more detailed than the first. It showed the path she had just taken, and then continued on, pushing even deeper into a region of sharp, unforgiving peaks labeled simply the Gorge. A new X marked a spot on the edge of a deep canyon, a place that, according to the territorial maps she had seen, was a blank, unexplored space. This was no longer just a journey. It was a pilgrimage. She was following the footsteps of a man who had made this wilderness his cathedral. She rested for only one night before pressing on, a sense of urgency now pulling at her, a feeling that she was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. The final leg of the journey was the most difficult of all, a descent into the gorge that was more a controlled fall than a hike. But Alistair Finch's map was a perfect guide. It led her to the one negotiable path, a switchback trail hidden by a screen of ancient firs. At the bottom of the gorge, beside a roaring river, hidden in a grove of aspen whose leaves had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, she found it. The third cabin. It was not a cabin. It was a home. It was built of massive, hand-hewn logs, fitted together with a shipwright's precision. A stone porch faced the rising sun, and a plume of smoke, impossibly, curled from its chimney. Harriet froze, her hand on Jed's neck. Was someone here? She approached with caution, her heart pounding. The smoke, she soon realized, was not from a fire, but was steam rising from a natural hot spring that had been cleverly piped into a stone-lined bathing pool behind the cabin. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cool and dry, smelling of cedar, beeswax, and old paper. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth clean and ready. The room was filled with the evidence of a life lived with purpose and craft. Shelves lined the walls, holding not just tins of food and supplies, but books, poetry, philosophy, geology, botany. A sturdy workbench stood in one corner, covered with finely made tools for surveying and map-making, and in the center of the room, on a massive table made from a single slab of pine, sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, easily 3 inches thick. It was closed, waiting. With a sense of reverence, Harriet ran her hand over the worn leather cover. This was it. This was the heart of the mystery. She opened it. The pages were not filled with words, but with maps, dozens upon dozens of them, executed with the breathtaking skill of a master cartographer. Alistair Finch had not just been a trapper, he had been a geographer, a scientist of the wilderness. For 20 years, he had systematically and secretly mapped the entire Sawtooth Range. His notes in the margins detailed water tables, timber quality, soil composition, and, most importantly, the precise location of mineral veins he had discovered. It was the life's work of a genius, a complete and perfect survey of a vast, uncharted territory. Tucked into a sleeve in the back cover of the ledger was a small, heavy tin box. Harriet opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of raw wool, was a doeskin pouch. She untied it and poured the contents onto the table. A river of gold dust and small, heavy nuggets cascaded out, gleaming in the soft light filtering through the window. It was a fortune, panned patiently over 2 decades from the mountain streams. Beneath the gold was one final folded letter. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was the same as the notes on the maps, elegant and precise. To the one who arrives, it began. If you are reading this, you have proven yourself possessed of the one quality I have come to value above all others: patience. You have not sought to conquer this land, but to listen to it. I have no heir of my blood, so I leave my work and my wealth to the one with the wit to follow my trail. The gold is yours, to provide a beginning. But the maps are the true treasure. They show what is, not what men in faraway offices have guessed to be. The boundary of this territory is wrong. The line is drawn a full 10 miles west of where it should be. The valley of this cabin, and all the timber and grazing land to the east of it, legally belongs to no one. It is waiting for the one with the knowledge to claim it. Use this work wisely. Do not let the greedy ones have it. This land does not wish to be owned, only to be stewarded. Alistair Finch. Harriet sank into the chair, the letter trembling in her hand. She looked from the gold to the ledger full of maps. She was no longer a dismissed servant. She was the heir to a hidden kingdom. Her discovery was so immense, so world-altering, that she spent the first few days in a daze, simply exploring the cabin and its surroundings, trying to comprehend the scale of Alistair Finch's legacy. She read his journals, which were separate from the survey ledger. He was a man who had fled the noise and greed of the world to find solace and truth in the high mountains. He wrote of the geology with a poet's soul, of the changing seasons with a philosopher's insight. Harriet felt she knew him, this quiet, brilliant man who had trusted the mountains more than people. She felt a profound sense of responsibility to honor his wishes. This valley was not just a claim to be filed, it was a sanctuary to be protected. She had found her purpose, but the mountains had one final test for her. The weather, which had been clear and cold, turned. The sky grew heavy and gray, the color of lead. A strange silence fell over the gorge, the birdsong ceasing, the wind dying down to an expectant hush. Then, the snow began. It started as gentle flakes, but within an hour it had become a blinding, furious blizzard. The wind howled through the canyon, a physical force that shook the sturdy cabin. Drifts began to pile up against the walls, quickly burying the windows on the north side. Harriet had never seen such a storm. She brought Jed into a small, attached lean-to that served as a woodshed, ensuring he was sheltered and had hay from the trapper's ample stores. For 3 days, the world outside vanished into a churning vortex of white. She was completely isolated, trapped in her newfound inheritance. She kept the fire roaring, cooked Finch's preserved food, and spent her time poring over the maps, memorizing the landscape he had so lovingly charted. The storm was terrifying, but the cabin was a fortress. Finch had built it to withstand the worst the mountains could offer. On the 4th day, the wind lessened slightly. Through a patch she had cleared on a window, Harriet was staring into the swirling snow when she saw movement. A dark shape, stumbling, struggling through the deep drifts. It was a man. He was barely on his feet, collapsing every few steps, his progress agonizingly slow. He was covered in snow, his face obscured, but she could see he was at the end of his strength. Without a second thought for her own safety, she pulled on Finch's heavy winter coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and plunged out into the storm, a rope in her hand. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow was waist-deep. She fought her way toward the fallen figure, shouting into the wind. He was nearly buried when she reached him, unconscious, his face pale and his lips blue. He was a prospector, judging by the pickaxe still clutched in his frozen hand. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get the rope around his chest and began the brutal task of dragging him back to the cabin. It took her the better part of an hour, every muscle screaming in protest. Inside, she stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in warm blankets near the fire. He was gaunt, his hands and feet showing the telltale white of severe frostbite. For the next 2 days, as the blizzard raged outside, she nursed him. She thawed his frozen limbs in lukewarm water, a painful, delicate process. She spoon-fed him warm broth made from dried venison she found in the larder. He was delirious, muttering about a lost claim and a partner who had left him. She sat by his side, keeping the fire high, her commitment to this place and its legacy solidifying with every act of care. She was using Alistair Finch's provisions to save a life. She was becoming the steward he had hoped for. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of white, the sky a piercing, brilliant blue. The prospector, whose name was Elias, was weak but lucid. He looked around the cabin with wide, disbelieving eyes, and then at Harriet. His gaze filled with a profound, humbled gratitude. You saved my life, miss," he stammered. "I thought I was a dead man for sure." He told her his story, how he and his partner had been caught in the storm, how they'd gotten separated, how he'd stumbled blindly for days before collapsing. Harriet simply nodded, offering him more broth. She didn't speak of the maps or the gold. It wasn't the time. When Elias was strong enough to travel, they prepared to leave. The journey out of the gorge was slow and difficult in the deep snow, but together they managed it, with Jed breaking trail like a seasoned plow. As they traveled back towards the town of Ketchum, a journey that took more than a week, a quiet friendship formed between them. Elias was a simple, honest man, and he was in awe of Harriet's capability and her quiet strength. When they finally rode into the main street, looking ragged and weathered, the townspeople stared. Silas Croft was standing on the porch of the land office and his jaw dropped. He had clearly presumed her dead, a foolish girl swallowed by the wilderness. Elias, before seeking out the doctor, stood beside Harriet and told his story to the gathered crowd. He spoke in a loud, clear voice, leaving no doubt as to what had happened. "This woman," he declared, pointing at Harriet, "found me half dead in the worst blizzard I've ever seen. She took me in, tended to my frostbite, and saved my life. She's got more grit and sense than any 10 men in this town." A murmur went through the crowd. They looked at Harriet differently now, not with pity or scorn, but with a new, grudging respect. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. His narrative of her foolishness had just been publicly dismantled. Harriet, ignoring the stares, walked directly into the land office, the heavy leather ledger under her arm. Mr. Ames, the clerk, looked up, his eyes wide. "Miss Lowe, we thought you were—" "I need to file a claim," she said, her voice steady. "And I need to see the territorial surveyor?" She heaved the ledger onto the counter. It landed with a solid, authoritative thud that echoed in the silent room. Croft pushed his way forward. What is this nonsense? Some trapper's diary? He reached for it, but Harriet placed her hand flat on the cover. "This," she said, looking him directly in the eye, "is the truth." The territorial surveyor, a quiet, meticulous man named Mr. Davies, was summoned from his office down the street. He was skeptical at first, but as he opened the ledger and began to examine Alistair Finch's work, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to utter astonishment. For a full week, he sequestered himself with the ledger, comparing its pages to the official government surveys. The town buzzed with speculation. Finally, Davies emerged, looking pale and deeply impressed. He called a public meeting at the land office. The room was packed. "For 20 years," Davies began, his voice filled with reverence, "a man named Alistair Finch, living in seclusion, conducted the most thorough and accurate survey of the Sawtooth Range ever undertaken." He held up one of Finch's maps. "His work proves, beyond any doubt, that the original territorial boundary survey of 1863 was flawed. The line is wrong." He unrolled the official map and used a charcoal pencil to draw a new line, a line that seeded a massive triangle of land, thousands of acres of prime timber and rich river valleys from federal jurisdiction. According to the law, Davies concluded, his voice ringing with authority, this land is unclaimed, untitled, and open to the first legal filing. A collective gasp went through the room. Silas Croft looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Harriet Lowe, using the gold Finch had left her, had already filed, her claim covering the hidden valley of the third cabin and the headwaters of the river. The fool girl had inherited a kingdom. The final scene unfolds 6 months later in the warm, slanting light of a late summer evening. The valley of the third cabin, now known simply as Finch Valley, is peaceful. Harriet Lowe stands on the stone porch of her home, looking out at the land she now stewards. The air is sweet with the smell of cut hay and pine. Below, in the lush meadow, Jed the mule grazes contentedly, his days of hard travel over. The valley is no longer empty, but it is not crowded. Elias, the prospector she saved, has become her foreman and loyal friend. He proved to be a man of his word, and his gratitude has transformed into a fierce, protective loyalty. He manages the small, sustainable timber operation she has established on the far side of the valley, using Finch's maps to select only fallen or aging trees, preserving the old-growth forest. A handful of other families have settled in the lower valley, families Harriet invited herself, people she knew to be hard-working, honest, and respectful of the land. They are building a community, not a boomtown. There is a one-room schoolhouse under construction and the beginnings of a grist mill on the river. The town of Ketchum now regards Finch Valley with a kind of mythic awe. Traders make the journey to buy their well-milled lumber and to gaze at the woman who outsmarted the mountains. Silas Croft, his reputation shattered and his speculative ventures souring, had left the territory in disgrace. Mr. Davies, the surveyor, is visiting. He stands beside Harriet on the porch, holding a newly printed official map of the territory. It shows the corrected boundary line, and within the new lands, the neatly drawn square of the Lowe claim. He is still marveling at Finch's work. "He was a remarkable man," Davies says quietly, "to have done all this alone with such precision." He looks at Harriet. People are calling you the queen of the sawtooths, you know. Harriet smiles, a small, private expression. She shakes her head. They have it wrong. Davies looks puzzled. What will you call this place, officially? Finch Valley is what the people say, but the deed needs a name. Harriet looks out at the vast, silent peaks turning gold and amber in the setting sun. She thinks of the dismissed servant girl who arrived with nothing, of the mocking laughter, of the old woman's cryptic words. She thinks of Alastair Finch's patient, brilliant solitude. She found more than land and gold. She had found a sense of belonging that was rooted in the earth itself. I didn't build this, she says, her voice quiet but clear, carrying the entire weight of her journey. I just found my way home. Thank you for staying with us for this incredible story of resilience and hidden worth. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not by those who seek to conquer, but by those who have the patience to listen. If you were moved by Harriet's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story about the quiet power of patience. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next tale from the annals of forgotten history. Until then, take care. What would you do if the only thing you could afford was the one place no one else would touch? For 19-year-old Lottie Fenn, cast out and alone in the Arizona Territory of 1882, the answer came in the form of a condemned saloon, bought for $2 and the laughter of the entire town. It was a place sealed by blood and memory, its windows boarded, its door a silent warning. But the truth waiting inside that derelict building was far more valuable and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. A secret bricked up and forgotten. A secret that would rewrite the history of a town built on lies. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, because this is a story about how the deepest truths are often found in the most forsaken places. Lottie Fenn arrived in Prescott with everything she owned in a single carpet bag and the dust of the Verde Valley staining the hem of her dress. The stagecoach left her in the center of town, a churning street of false-fronted buildings, where the air tasted of grit and mulehide. She felt the eyes of men on her, appraising, dismissing. She was young, alone, and carried the quiet shame of being put out. Her former employer, a rancher named Abernathy with a fat belly and wandering hands, had given her an ultimatum. She had chosen the road. The memory was a fresh bruise, his voice slick with false kindness, turning sharp when she refused him. The door of the bunkhouse shutting behind her for the last time. The long walk to the stage stop with his wife's pitying stare following her down the lane. She had worked for them for a year, saving every spare penny, dreaming of buying a small plot of land, a piece of the world that could not be taken from her. Now her savings felt impossibly small, a handful of coins against the vast, indifferent landscape. She carried a deeper loss, too, one that had defined her entire life. Her father, a prospector named Thomas Fenn, had been gone for 5 years, lost in a cave-in at the Lucky 7 mine. She remembered his hands, calloused and kind, the smell of pine and earth on his clothes. He had been a quiet man who believed in the honesty of rock and the promise buried within it. His death had left her adrift, a grief so constant it had become a part of her breathing. Prescott was his last known town, the place he'd sent his final letter from, full of hope about a new claim. Coming here was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way to be close to the last place he had been whole. She found a room at a boarding house run by a stern-faced woman who asked no questions, so long as the rent was paid in advance. For 2 days, Lottie walked the town, listening more than she spoke. She heard the name of Marshall Brody spoken in low, careful tones. She saw the swagger of the men from the Consolidated Mining Company, their pockets heavy with company script. And she saw the saloon. It stood at the edge of the respectable part of town, a sagging, derelict structure hunched between a blacksmith and an empty lot. Its name, the Gilded Cage, was barely visible on a faded sign that swung from a single rusty hinge. The windows were boarded over with weathered planks, and a notice of condemnation from the territorial government was nailed to the door, yellowed and peeling. The townsfolk gave it a wide berth, their gazes skittering away from it as if it held a contagion. Lottie asked the clerk at the land office about it, a young man with ink stains on his fingers. That place? He'd scoffed, not bothering to look up from his ledger. The old Blackwood place. Been shut for years. Marshall Brody closed it down himself after Blackwood and a drifter killed each other over a card game. Place is a mess. Blood on the floorboards they could never scrub out. Condemned. Lottie felt a strange pull, a kinship with the abandoned building. It was an outcast, just like her. Is it for sale? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The clerk finally looked at her, a smirk playing on his lips. The town owns it for back taxes. They'd probably pay you to take it. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. But you can have it for the debt. $2. It was a joke, a taunt. $2 was an insult. It was the price of a thing so worthless it couldn't even be given away. Lottie reached into her reticule, her fingers closing around the few coins she had left. She placed $2 silver on the counter. The clerk's smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief. You're serious? She met his gaze, her own steady and clear. I am. He drew up the deed with a theatrical flourish, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet office. As he handed her the paper, he shook his head. Good luck, miss. You'll need it. Lottie folded the deed and placed it in her bag. She owned something, a broken, blood-stained, forgotten something. But it was hers. Walking out into the harsh sunlight, she felt a sliver of something that had been absent for 5 years. The faintest glimmer of a future. The saloon was hers. The whispers followed her down the plank sidewalk like stray dogs. She felt them more than heard them, a current of disbelief and mockery that parted the air around her. Bought the old Blackwood place, a woman murmured behind her hand at the general store. That young thing? All by her lonesome? A man leaning against a post spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. More fool her. That place is haunted by bad luck and worse men. Lottie ignored them. She had been the subject of whispers before. They were just noise, like the ceaseless wind that swept through the high desert. She spent her last few coins on a heavy pry bar, a bucket, and a block of lye soap. Practical things. Things with weight and purpose. She walked to the saloon, the deed a small, stiff rectangle in her pocket. The condemned notice on the door was brittle. She tore it off, the paper crumbling in her hand. The wood of the door was swollen tight in its frame. She put her shoulder into it, then again, grunting with the effort. It wouldn't budge. She was about to use the pry bar when a voice, dry as a riverbed in August, spoke from behind her. That door ain't been opened by man nor beast in 5 years. It's forgotten how. Lottie turned. An old Apache woman sat on a crate in the shade of the blacksmith's awning, a bundle of dried herbs in her lap. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. The townsfolk seemed to ignore her, another fixture they had learned not to see. Lottie had noticed her before, a silent observer on the edge of things. The woman's name, she'd heard someone say, was Ilara. Ilara looked from Lottie to the defiant door. "Some doors are sealed to keep trouble out," she said, her voice low and even. "Others are sealed to keep truth in." She held Lottie's gaze for a long moment, an unspoken message passing between them. Then she looked back at her herbs, her part in the conversation apparently over. Lottie pondered the woman's words. Truth. What truth could be in a place like this, other than the simple, brutal truth of a violent end? She turned back to the door, this time examining the frame. Using the tip of the pry bar, she worked it into the gap, leveraging her slight weight against it. The wood groaned, a long, mournful sound of surrender. With a final, cracking pop, the door swung inward into a square of absolute darkness. The air that rushed out was stale and thick, smelling of sour whiskey, old dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang she couldn't place. It smelled of regret. She stood on the threshold, letting her eyes adjust. What had she done? What madness had led her to trade her last dollars for this tomb? Was this just another mistake in a long line of them? Perhaps the whole town was right to laugh. But what other choice did she have? What secret could possibly be worth this ruin? Let us know what you think Lottie should do next in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. For now, Lottie took a deep breath of the dusty, forgotten air and stepped across the threshold into the darkness that was now hers. The first voice of open mockery belonged to Marshall Brody. He found her the next morning as she was wrestling with the first of the boards over the front window. He was a big man, made bigger by the authority of the badge pinned to his chest and the Colt revolver that sat low on his hip. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged. He stopped a few feet away, hooking his thumbs in his belt, a condescending smile playing on his lips. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice carrying down the street. "Heard the town had a new fool. Didn't figure it'd be a slip of a girl." Lottie didn't stop her work. She jammed the pry bar under the edge of the plank and threw her weight against it. The nails shrieked but held fast. "This is private property, Marshall," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was even, betraying none of the fear that coiled in her stomach. Brody chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Private property? This is a public hazard, is what it is. I condemned it myself. Should have burned it down, but the town council is soft." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. Blackwood was a troublemaker. Got what was coming to him. This place, it holds on to things like that. Bad feelings. You'd be smart to walk away from it. Sell the deed back to the town for $1. Cut your losses. His concern was false, a thin veneer over something else, a possessiveness, as if he had a claim on the building's ruin. "I paid $2, Lottie said, giving the pry bar another heave. A nail groaned and popped free. "I expect to get my money's worth." "Your money's worth?" He laughed out loud now, a full-throated sound of derision that drew the attention of a few passers-by. "Honey, all you bought is a pile of rotten wood and ghosts. You listen to me. There's nothing for you in there." His eyes, small and hard, scanned the decaying facade of the building. Nothing at all. He lingered for another moment, as if waiting for her to break, to falter. When she simply reset her grip on the pry bar, he shook his head in theatrical pity and turned away. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he called over his shoulder as he sauntered off. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the morning heat. It wasn't a friendly piece of advice. It was an order disguised as one. That evening, Silas, the owner of the livery stable, stopped by. He was a quiet, weathered man who had known her father slightly, and he was the only person in town who had offered a kind word. He'd seen her struggling with the boards and had come with a heavy mallet and a longer crowbar. He didn't speak of the marshal or the town's gossip. He just handed her the tools. "Thomas was a good man," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the saloon. "Worked hard. He talked about you. Said you had his same stubborn spine." He looked at her, his eyes kind. "If you need a hot meal, my wife always makes too much." Lottie felt a knot of emotion tighten in her throat. "Thank you, Silas." "Don't thank me," he grunted, turning to leave. "Just be careful. This town has long memories, and some of them are best left undisturbed." His words, so different in tone from the marshal's, carried their own weight. He wasn't warning her away. He was warning her to be watchful. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Lottie finally pulled the last board from the first window. A rectangle of fading light fell into the saloon, illuminating a world of dust motes dancing in the air. The warning from the marshal and the quiet caution from Silas circled in her mind, two opposing forces. One sought to drive her away with contempt, the other to keep her safe with care. And then she remembered the old Apache woman's words. Some doors are sealed to keep truth in. A chill, unrelated to the evening air, traced a path down her spine. A truth. What truth could Marshal Brody possibly want to keep buried in a place like this? With a new sense of purpose, Lottie took a lantern and stepped back inside, the darkness no longer just an absence of light, but a vessel for a secret. The beam from her lantern cut a shaky circle through the gloom, revealing the full scope of the saloon's decay. The air was a physical presence, thick with the ghosts of spilled liquor and cold cigar smoke. A fine layer of dust, as pale as ash, coated everything, softening the sharp edges of the ruin. Overturned tables and broken chairs lay scattered across the floor, like the aftermath of a sudden, violent storm. Shards of glass from shattered bottles and mirrors crunched under her boots. It was a place where all sound had died. Her light found the bar first. It was a magnificent wreck, a long, dark slash of mahogany. Its surface was scarred with knife marks and the dark rings of countless glasses. A section of it was splintered and broken where a body, or perhaps just a fist, had crashed through it. Behind the bar, shelves lay in a tangled heap on the floor. The great mirror that should have been there was a spiderweb of cracks, its silvered surface clouded and blind. Lottie set her lantern down on a relatively stable portion of the bar, the small flame pushing the oppressive darkness back a few feet. She had decided to sleep here, in her own property. She didn't have the money for another week at the boarding house. And more than that, she felt a need to claim the space, to inhabit it and make it hers through sheer presence. Her bedroll, laid out in the cleanest corner she could find, looked small and vulnerable in the vast, haunted room. She ate a dry biscuit and drank from her canteen, the silence of the saloon pressing in on her. Every creak of the old building settling, every skittering sound of a mouse in the walls was magnified. It was easy to believe in ghosts here. She thought of her father, trying to conjure his face, the steady calm in his eyes. He had never been afraid of hard work or dark places. He'd spent half his life underground, reading stories in the rock. He would have looked at this place not as a ruin, but as a project. He would have started with a broom. So she did. She found a worn-out broom in a back storage closet and began to sweep, the rhythmic scrape and whisper of the bristles a comforting human sound against the profound silence. She worked her way from the back to the front, creating a small island of clean floorboards around her bedroll. The dust she swept up was heavy and dark, mingled with old sawdust and the debris of 100 forgotten nights. As she worked her way toward the front, near the door, her foot scuffed against something. She bent down, holding the lantern closer. Carved into the floorboards, almost invisible under the grime, was a set of initials: T.F. Thomas Fenn. Her breath caught in her chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. Fenn was not an uncommon name. But here, in this place? She traced the letters with her finger. The carving was rough, done with the tip of a knife, the way a man might absent-mindedly mark a spot while waiting. A memory surfaced, sudden and sharp. Her father, sitting on their porch, carving her own initials, L.F., into a piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. The style was the same: the straight, deep cut of the T, the slight curve of the F. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Her father had been here, in this saloon. This wasn't just a random place he passed through. He had sat here, in this spot, long enough to leave his mark. Why had he never mentioned it? His letters spoke of the mine, the claim, the hard work. They never spoke of saloons or card games. It didn't fit the man she knew. She sat back on her heels, the lantern light flickering across the rough letters. The saloon was no longer just a derelict building she had bought out of desperation. It was now a connection, a final, tangible link to her father. The place held more than just bad memories and old dust. It held a piece of him. That night, she slept deeply, the ghosts of the gilded cage seeming less like a threat and more like silent witnesses. She was no longer just reclaiming a building. She was searching for the ghost of her father. The discovery of his initials changed the nature of her work. It was no longer just about survival, about carving out a space for herself. It became an act of archaeology, a careful excavation of the past. Each shovelful of debris, each piece of broken furniture she cleared, felt like a question she was asking the silent room. What happened here? Why were you in this place, Father? The next morning, she started on the bar. It was the heart of the saloon, the center of the violence that had shut its doors. If there were answers to be found, they would be near it. The structure was too heavy to move, so she began by clearing the wreckage around and behind it. She filled her bucket with shattered glass, splintered wood, and unrecognizable bits of rusted metal, carrying load after load out to a heap in the back alley. The work was slow and grueling. Her hands, already calloused, began to blister. Her back ached, but the physical labor was a balm. It quieted the noise in her head, focusing her mind on the simple, honest reality of the task in front of her. As she cleared the debris from behind the bar, she began to notice something odd about the wall. Most of the saloon's interior was rough-hewn planks, but this back wall was made of brick, a chimney stack at one end. Yet the section directly behind the center of the bar was different. The bricks were a slightly different shade of red, a bit newer, less weathered than the rest. The mortar was paler, a sandy beige that stood out from the crumbling, soot-stained gray of the surrounding joints. It was a patch, a clumsy, hasty one. It wasn't flush with the rest of the wall. It bulged out almost imperceptibly, a shallow curve in the flat surface. Lottie ran her hand over it. The bricks felt solid, immovable. It could be a simple repair, damage from the brawl that had closed the place. A man thrown against the wall, a few bricks knocked loose and replaced. That was the logical explanation, but it didn't feel right. Her father had taught her to look for the thing that was out of place, the seam in the rock that signaled a hidden vein of ore. This wall was a seam. The memory of Ilara's words returned. Some doors are sealed to keep truth in. This wasn't a repair. It felt like a seal. It was too deliberate, too large. The patch was nearly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Who would re-brick an entire section of wall for a minor repair? She set the thought aside for the moment, telling herself she was imagining things, letting the strangeness of the place get to her. She continued her work, focusing on tearing out the most damaged sections of the mahogany bar top, prying up the splintered wood to see what the foundation beneath was like. But her eyes kept drifting back to the brick wall. The color difference seemed more pronounced in the shifting light of the afternoon. The bulge seemed to mock her, a silent, stony secret. That evening, after a simple meal, she didn't unroll her bedding. Instead, she took her lantern and a small hammer she'd found and approached the wall. She tapped one of the bricks in the center of the patch. It gave a dull, solid thud. She tapped a brick on the older part of the wall. The sound was deeper, more resonant, with a faint echo. There was a space behind the new bricks, a hollow space. A cold certainty settled in her stomach. This was not a patch. It was a doorway, a hidden one. She did not act on it that night. The discovery was too large, the implications too unnerving. She needed to live with it, to let the reality of it settle. She laid out her bedroll, but sleep did not come easily. The saloon was no longer just a place of memory. It was a place of secrets, and she felt the weight of them pressing down in the darkness, waiting for her to find the courage to bring them into the light. The next day, she bought a heavy sledgehammer and a cold chisel from the blacksmith, spending the last of her savings. The blacksmith, a burly man with soot on his face, gave her a curious look. "Tearing something down or building something up?" he asked. "A bit of both, I think," Lottie replied. The weight of the hammer in her hands was both terrifying and empowering. This was an act of violation, of breaking and entering into the saloon's sealed past. She stood before the wall for a long time, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. This was the point of no return. Whatever lay behind this wall, Blackwood or someone else, had not wanted it found. Marshall Brody's warning echoed in her mind. There's nothing for you in there. Had he known about this? Was this the nothing he was so eager for her to ignore? Lottie took a deep breath, gripped the sledgehammer, and swung. The first blow was clumsy, striking the mortar joint with a jarring crack that sent a puff of pale dust into the air. The brick held. She swung again, harder this time, putting her back and her grief and her anger into it. The hammer hit the center of a brick with a satisfying crunch. A spiderweb of cracks appeared. The third swing shattered the brick, revealing not wood or earth, but a dark, empty space behind it. A pocket of stale, trapped air sighed out, carrying a faint scent of paper and dry leather. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was right. It was a room. She worked methodically now, using the chisel and a smaller hammer to chip away at the mortar, loosening the surrounding bricks one by one. Each brick she removed widened the hole, letting more light into the hidden space. It was slow, painstaking work. The mortar was stubborn, and her arms ached with the strain. Sawdust and grit filled the air, coating her face and hair. She worked for hours, losing track of time, focused only on the task. The sun moved across the sky, its beams slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating her solitary labor. Finally, the opening was large enough to squeeze through. She peered inside, holding her lantern ahead of her. It was a small, windowless room, no bigger than a pantry. It was an office. A desk and a single chair stood against the far wall. A small, cast-iron safe was tucked into the corner, and papers. Papers were everywhere, stacked on the desk, spilling from open drawers, scattered on the floor, as if left in a great hurry. The room was a perfectly preserved moment in time, sealed away from the dust and decay of the saloon outside. Lottie squeezed through the opening, her boots landing softly on the floorboards. She raised the lantern high. The beam fell across a ledger lying open on the desk. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the neat columns of names and figures. The names were a roll call of the most powerful men in Prescott. The mine foreman from Consolidated, the owner of the general store, the land agent. And next to each name, a date and a sum of money. The last entry was for Marshall Brody. The sum beside his name was the largest. It was a book of bribes. Her hand trembled as she turned a page. Tucked into the ledger was a sheaf of letters, written in a cramped, angry hand. She recognized the signature at the bottom of the one on top. Silas Blackwood, the saloon's former owner. She began to read. Brody promises the claim will be ours once Fenn and McGregor are out of the way. He says a cave-in is the cleanest way. No questions asked. The assay report shows they were sitting on the mother lode, and the marshal wants his cut for making it disappear. The lantern slipped in her grasp, the room tilting around her. Fenn, her father, Thomas Fenn. It wasn't a cave-in. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. She sank into the dusty chair, the letter shaking in her hand. She read on, her vision blurring with tears. The letters laid it all out. A conspiracy between Marshall Brody, the Consolidated mine foreman, and Silas Blackwood to steal her father's claim. Her father and his partner, a man named McGregor, had filed a claim on a small, independent plot that turned out to be richer than anyone knew. The company wanted it, and Brody was their instrument. Blackwood was the go-between, the one who handled the payments and kept the records. But the last letter revealed a falling out. Blackwood was demanding a larger share, threatening to expose the whole thing. The letter was dated the day before the brawl that had killed him. The fight hadn't been over a card game. It had been an execution. The drifter was likely an assassin sent by Brody to silence Blackwood and seal this room forever. She looked at the small iron safe in the corner. If the letters were here, what was in there? It took her the rest of the day to find the combination, hidden cleverly on the spine of a book on the desk. When the heavy door finally swung open, it revealed stacks of gold certificates and, tucked in the back, 2 official-looking documents. They were the original assay reports and the deed to her father's claim, the Lucky 7, signed over to the Consolidated Mining Company 2 days after his supposed death. The signature was a forgery. Lottie sat on the floor of the hidden room, surrounded by the evidence of her father's murder and the theft of his legacy. The grief was a physical blow, a fresh agony that stole her breath. But beneath the grief, a cold, hard anger began to form. They had not just killed her father. They had erased him, turning his life's work into a lie. They had left her an orphan, penniless and alone, while they grew rich on his discovery. The town that had mocked her, the marshal who had warned her away, they were all complicit, either through corruption or ignorance. The saloon was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb, and she had just unearthed its secrets. And now she knew she had to be its voice. A storm was coming. Lottie could feel it in the air, a restless energy that made the dust devils dance in the street and the old saloon timbers groan. It mirrored the tempest inside her. She spent the night in the hidden office. The letters and deeds spread before her on the desk, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She did not sleep. She read and reread, committing every word, every name, every date to memory. The story they told was so monstrous, so complete in its villainy, that it felt like something from a penny dreadful. But this was real. This was her father's life, and his death. By dawn, the anger had burned away the fear, leaving behind a cold, clear resolve. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew she couldn't simply walk to the nearest authority. The highest authority in Prescott was Marshall Brody, the man at the center of the conspiracy. She was a 19-year-old girl with no standing and no allies against the most powerful man in town. Presenting this evidence would be signing her own death warrant. The sky outside had turned a bruised, greenish yellow. The wind was picking up, howling around the corners of the saloon. As she was bundling the papers into her carpet bag, she heard a frantic pounding on the front door. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Had Brody found out? Was he here already? "Hello? Please, is anyone in there?" The voice was a woman's, thin with panic. Lottie crept to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. A family, a man, a pregnant woman, and a small child were huddled on the porch, their wagon and horses looking panicked in the street. "The storm!" the man shouted over the wind. "It came up so fast. The livery is full. Please, can we just shelter in here?" Lottie looked at their desperate faces. Helping them meant revealing herself, revealing that the saloon was occupied. But turning them away in a storm like this, it wasn't something she could do. It wasn't something her father would have done. She unbarred the door and let them in, just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. They stumbled inside, shaking and grateful, their eyes wide at the ruin within. "Thank you, miss," the woman said, clutching her belly. "We're the Millers, heading to California." Just then, the saloon door was thrust open again with a bang. Marshall Brody stood on the threshold, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his face a mask of thunder. He wasn't looking at the Millers. His eyes were fixed on the opening in the brick wall, the pile of rubble and the faint lantern glow from within. He knew. "I warned you," he said, his voice a low growl. He took a step inside, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "I told you to leave this place alone." The Millers shrank back, terrified. Lottie moved to stand between Brody and the hole in the wall, her small frame the only barrier to the secrets in that room. Her carpet bag, containing the evidence, was on the floor just behind her. "This is my property, Marshall," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're trespassing." "Your property?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that was swallowed by a clap of thunder. "You own nothing. Blackwood owned nothing. This all belongs to the company." He took another step, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Now, you're going to be a good little girl and hand over whatever you found in there. We can forget this whole thing. You can walk away." The wind shrieked, and the rain began to fall in sheets, drumming on the roof like a frantic heartbeat. This was the test, the moment of choice. She could give him the papers, save herself, and let her father's murder remain a secret forever. Or she could fight. She thought of her father's honest hands, of the initials carved in the floor, of the life he never got to live. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the space between them. Brody's face hardened. He drew his gun. "I won't ask again." Suddenly, the side door that led to the alley burst open, Silas, the livery owner, stood there, a shotgun held steady in his hands. "I think you should be on your way, Marshal," Silas said, his voice calm but unyielding. "This young lady is under my protection, and it seems she has guests." Brody was caught, his fury warring with the cold reality of the shotgun and the 3 witnesses cowering by the wall. To shoot Lottie now would be an act of open murder, not something that could be easily explained away. He glared at Lottie, his eyes burning with a promise of future retribution. "This isn't over," he spat. Then he turned and strode out into the raging storm, slamming the door behind him. The crisis had passed, but Lottie knew the real storm was just beginning. She had survived the confrontation, but now she had to win the war. The storm broke by morning, leaving the air washed clean and the dust settled. The Miller family, their fear replaced by a quiet awe, left soon after, promising to tell anyone who would listen what they had seen. Silas stayed. He looked from Lottie to the gaping hole in the wall, then back to her face, which was pale but resolute. "Your father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He came to me the week before the accident. He said he was on to something big. He was worried. Said if anything happened to him, I should. But he never finished. Never told me what to do." Silas shook his head, a deep regret in his eyes. "I should have pressed him. I'm sorry, Lottie." "You're here now, Silas," she said, and that was enough. They knew they couldn't stay in Prescott. Brody was humiliated, and a man like that was more dangerous than ever. He wouldn't risk another public confrontation, but an accident in a dark alley, a fire in the night, those were his specialties. The nearest place with any real authority was Phoenix, the territorial capital. It was a 2-day ride. Silas arranged for a sturdy wagon and a pair of mules. While he was gone, Lottie went back into the hidden office and gathered every last scrap of paper, every ledger, every letter. She wrapped them in oilcloth and secured them in her carpet bag. As she worked, an idea began to form, a way to protect not just the evidence, but the truth itself. Before they left, under the cover of the pre-dawn gray, Lottie did one last thing. With a bucket of whitewash borrowed from Silas, she painted a single large word across the boarded-up front of the gilded cage. Truth. The journey to Phoenix was tense. Every rider on the horizon, every shadow on the trail, seemed like a threat. Silas drove the wagon, his shotgun always within reach, while Lottie sat beside him, the carpet bag clutched in her lap. They spoke little, the weight of their purpose creating its own silent language. When they arrived, they didn't go to the local law. They went straight to the offices of the territorial circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne, known for his stern demeanor and incorruptible reputation. The clerk tried to turn them away, but Lottie's quiet insistence, the mention of Marshal Brody and Consolidated Mining, finally earned them a brief audience. Judge Thorne was a formidable man with eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's intentions. He listened without interruption as Lottie, her voice clear and steady, laid out the entire story. She didn't embellish or plead. She simply told the facts, presenting the letters, the ledger, and the forged deed one by one. She placed the original assay report on his desk last. The judge picked it up, his face impassive. He read it, then read it again. He held it to the light, examining the watermark, the signature, the seal. He was a kind professional, his competence a quiet, reassuring force. He looked from the report to Lottie. "This is your father's hand?" he asked, pointing to Thomas Fenn's signature on the original claim filing. "Yes, sir," Lottie said. He then picked up the deed that signed the claim over to Consolidated. And this? No, sir. That is not his hand. The judge was silent for a long time, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. The entire future hinged on his next words. Finally, he lowered his hands. A U.S. Marshal will be dispatched to Prescott by week's end, he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. They will take Marshal Brody and the mine foreman into custody. Warrants will be issued for the others. The consolidated claim on the Lucky 7 mine is hereby frozen pending a federal investigation. It was over. Just like that. The vindication was so sudden, so complete, that Lottie felt lightheaded. As they were leaving, Judge Thorne stopped her. "Miss Fenn," he said, his stern face softening for the first time. "What you have done, it required a great deal of courage. Your father would be proud." News traveled fast in the territory. By the time Lottie and Silas returned to Prescott a week later, the town was transformed. The U.S. Marshals had already come and gone, taking a sullen and defeated Brody with them. The mine foreman was in custody, and the other men named in Blackwood's ledger were in a state of panic. The townspeople who had once mocked her now watched her with a mixture of awe and respect. The word painted on her saloon had become a landmark. People would stop and look at it, speaking in hushed tones. Truth. Lottie had done more than uncover a crime. She had given the town its history back, exposing the rot at its foundation. The story of the girl who bought a condemned saloon for $2 and brought down the most powerful men in the region was already becoming a legend. The change in the town was palpable. The fear that had been a constant undercurrent was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. Families who had been cheated by Consolidated began to speak to lawyers. Other prospectors felt emboldened to re-examine old claims. Lottie's single act of courage had created a ripple of justice. The Millers, the family she had sheltered, had reached a town down the line and told their story to a reporter for a territorial newspaper. The article, headlined "The Angel of Prescott and the Devil's Due," painted Lottie as a hero, and people began to arrive in town just to see the saloon and the young woman who had uncovered its secrets. Lottie, however, wanted no part of the legend. She deflected the praise and focused on her work. With the gold certificates from the safe, now legally hers as her father's heir, she had the means to properly restore the saloon. She hired Silas to oversee the work, and slowly the gilded cage began to shed its skin of ruin and neglect. She had the main room cleared and cleaned, the broken furniture replaced, the scarred bar sanded down and refinished until the mahogany glowed once more. She replaced the shattered mirror with a new, clear one, but she left the hole in the brick wall, framing it neatly. She turned the hidden office into a small private dining room, a quiet memorial to the truth it had held. She decided not to reopen it as a saloon. The name, the Gilded Cage, felt wrong now. It was a name from the past, a past of corruption and violence. The building was something else now, something more. It was a place of reckoning. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the dusty street, Lottie stood in the doorway of the restored building. The air was cool and smelled of new pine and varnish. Silas walked up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the clean lines of the building, the new glass in the windows, the steady lamplight glowing from within. "It's a fine place now, Lottie," he said. "What are you going to call it?" Lottie looked out at the town, at the people walking by who now nodded at her with genuine respect. She thought of her father, of the long journey that had brought her here, of the ruin she had purchased, and the truth she had found within it. She had come to Prescott seeking a connection to her father's memory and had ended up restoring his legacy. She hadn't just cleaned up a building, she had built a foundation. "I think," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet moral of her entire journey, "I'll call it the Founder's House." Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible story. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest value is hidden right beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the patience to find it. If you were moved by Lottie's journey, please give this video a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and unexpected triumph. We'll see you next time.